Hey everyone, Rich here. I'm just getting over COVID and my voice is not ideal. I know I sound a little nasally and I apologize for that, but I didn't want to miss an episode, so I recorded anyway. Here's the episode.
Up from the poor man's cottage, forth from the mansion door, sweeping across the valley and echoing along the shore, caught by the morning breezes, borne on the evening gale, comes the voice of morning, a sad and solemn wail. Lost on the Lady Elgin, sleeping to wake no more, numbered with those 300 who failed to reach the shore.
This was a clip from the song Lost on the Lady Elgin, written by Henry Clay Work in 1861, and performed by Lee Murdoch. It tells the story of the Lady Elgin, the greatest shipwreck tragedy on the Great Lakes. The song will be played in its entirety at the conclusion of the episode. The Lost Lady of the Lake, the Lady Elgin, today, on Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs. Hello and welcome to Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs, tales of mishaps, misfortune, and misadventure. Thank you so much for listening. The Great Lakes have a long and storied maritime history. The first sailing ship on the Great Lakes dates back to the Griffin, built by the French explorer La Salle in 1679. Ever since, passenger, cargo, and excursion ships have been the lifeblood for many communities along the shores of the 5 Great Lakes. The story of the Lady Elgin is one of great sorrow, and especially for many families from the greater Milwaukee, Wisconsin area. To help me tell this story, I spoke with historian Paul Timm, author of the book Lost Lady, The Lady Elgin Tragedy. Paul is a Wisconsin native whose relatives died on the Lady Elgin, and he's going to tell us about his efforts to find them. I was also joined by Laura Zeeland, creator and host of the Archive Unknown podcast, and Laura has some interesting bits of history that she was able to dig up from the archives, which is her specialty. Laura is a wonderful storyteller, and I'm very happy to have had her as my guest. The Lady Elgin was built at Buffalo, New York in 1851 by the renowned shipbuilders Bidwell, Banta and Company. She was a sidewheel paddle steamer, measuring 252 feet, 33.7 feet wide, and had two 32-foot paddle wheels. She was named after Lady Mary Louisa Lambton, the wife of Lord Elgin, the Governor-General of Canada. Made of pure white oak with iron reinforcements, she could carry 200 cabin passengers, 100 deck passengers, 43 crew, and 800 tons of cargo. In her early years, she transported passengers between Buffalo, New York, and Chicago, Illinois. The Lady Elgin was one of the largest steamers on the Great Lakes at the time. Her speed and her luxurious accommodations made the Lady Elgin a quite popular ship. But some believe the Lady Elgin was a doomed ship right from the beginning. The ship's boilers and engine were salvaged from the former slave ship Cleopatra, and this did not sit well with some. The Cleopatra herself held some grim tales, as can be imagined on a slave ship. Others cited a maritime superstition, believing it is bad luck to name a ship starting with the letter A. The bad luck, however, was soon to strike. Here's Laura Zeeland, host and creator of the podcast Archive Unknown.
As we know, she goes down in the early hours of September 8th, 1860. What are the odds that these two ships would be at this exact location to ram each other in a huge lake during a gale? I mean, it seems super weird to me. And what's also weird to me is how accident-prone the Lady Elgin was during her time on the Great Lakes. I mean, this ship could not catch a break. So during Lady Elgin's career, she was involved in numerous accidents. She sank and was repaired in 1854 after striking a rock at Manitowoc, Wisconsin. Then the next year, in 1855, she was towed to Chicago after an accident to her machinery. In 1857, she was damaged by a fire. Then just the next year, in June 1858, she struck a reef at Copper Harbor, Michigan. Then that same year, as if that wasn't enough, she was stranded on the Ausable Point Reef in Lake Superior. Then the next year, October 1859, she was towed to Marquette, Michigan after breaking her crossbeam. And then that same year, she was towed again when her crank pin broke near Point Iroquois, Michigan. So accidents and mishaps and errors and blunders and tragedy are sort of part and parcel to the Lady Elgin tale.
Superstitions aside, the incidents the Lady Elgin had already experienced during her first 9 years certainly would not be considered good luck. On the bright side, after having been damaged so many times, the ship had received a steady stream of upgrades and refurbishing. By 1860, the repaired but still beautiful ship was once again taking passengers on excursions. It's at this point I believe some background history is required, especially for non-American listeners. In 1860, the American Civil War had not yet begun, but tensions over the issue of slavery and states' rights was reaching its zenith. The pressure had been building, arguably since the country's founding in 1776. The U.S. Constitution itself contained the 3/5 Compromise, followed by the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, the Missouri Compromise of 1820, the Second Missouri Compromise of 1821, the Congressional Gag Rule from 1831 to 1844, preventing the issue of slavery from even being discussed, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, and finally the Crittenden Compromise of 1860. Now, I'm not going to explain all of those, but just understand that each one of those was trying to find a middle ground between slave states and free states, often providing concessions to both sides. Each one of these acts would be considered as a pressure release valve, only temporarily reducing the pressure as it continued to build. In 1854, a runaway slave named Joshua Glover reached the northern city of Racine, Wisconsin, where he was arrested according to the Fugitive Slave Act. But a mob of abolitionists, led by Sherman Booth, broke him out of jail and helped him flee to Canada. In response, the state's governor, Alexander Randall, who was also an abolitionist, demanded the federal government officially abolish slavery. He openly threatened to secede from the Union if it didn't. The governor asked all units of the state's militia to declare their loyalty to the state or the federal government. All state militia units pledged loyalty to the state, except for one, the Irish Union Guard of Milwaukee's 3rd Ward. Led by Garrett Berry, the unit sided with current President James Buchanan and the federal government, and did not wish to secede from the Union, believing secession was treason. In response, Governor Randall stripped them of their arms and revoked the commission of Garrett Berry, and rather than disband, they began raising funds to replenish their arsenal. Here is Wisconsin native and author Paul Timm.
People don't realize that Wisconsin was looking to secede from the Union, and that's what Garrett Berry got so upset about. He goes, that's treason, so I can't do that. And he had served in the Mexican War. So, yeah, all that politicking and things led to this whole disaster. And actually, Governor Randall took a lot of heat for this one after it happened, because they said, well, they wouldn't have had to go if you wouldn't have taken the guns. And they had never done anything wrong. Berry was so upset. He goes, you're making us guilty of a crime that hasn't happened. You haven't seceded and we didn't, so how can you do that? And there really was no good answer.
On the evening of September 7, 1860, Berry chartered a ship to take the unit from Milwaukee, Wisconsin to Chicago, Illinois, where they could raise funds and attend a campaign speech by Democratic presidential candidate Stephen Douglas. The ship they chartered for the night was the Lady Elgin. As the militiamen of the Irish Union Guard boarded the Lady Elgin, spirits were high, and the men were hopeful. Estimates vary across many sources, but anywhere between 350 to 700 people were on board, most of them members of the militia unit, as well as about 50 other passengers and 35 crew. As was the case with so many other boats and ships of the time, it is highly likely the number of people on board surpassed its capacity. They were going to Chicago to raise funds and attend a campaign speech by Democratic presidential candidate Stephen Douglas. The unit was now backing Douglas, who was running against Abraham Lincoln of the newly formed Republican Party. The soldiers attended their events, although they never did get to meet Stephen Douglas. At the end of the day, they and other passengers returned to the ship to travel back home to Milwaukee. On the bridge, Captain Jack Wilson was concerned. There was a storm approaching over Lake Michigan, and he was hesitant to depart. But the Lady Elgin did not have enough cabins for all the passengers on board, and he was pressured to get them home to Milwaukee. The Lady Elgin departed Chicago around 11:30 p.m. on September 7, 1860. At first, all was well as the ship began the 90-mile trip back to Milwaukee. There was even a German brass band playing, much to the delight of those on board. Passengers danced, drank, and mingled into the early morning hours. At 2 o'clock a.m., with the revelry still going, the Lady Elgin encountered a storm, which quickly turned into a full-on gale. Some passengers headed for the staterooms, but still, the party continued. The crew of the ship battled the powerful wind, fierce thunderstorm, and violent seas. Wilson was an experienced mariner, being the first captain to guide a ship through the Sioux Locks connecting Lake Superior to Lake Huron in 1855, and he had never lost a passenger on any of his ships. Wilson continued on course, directly into the storm, but nothing could have prepared him for what was about to occur. Around the same time, the lumber cargo ship Augusta was heading south on Lake Michigan for Chicago, also through the blinding storm. Its captain, Darius Malott, was guiding the schooner from Port Huron, Michigan, to Chicago. Despite being in the midst of a strong gale, the Augusta was inexplicably at full sail, traveling at a speed of 11 knots. Its cargo of lumber had shifted, causing her to list to one side. The second mate of the Augusta spotted the bright lights of the Lady Elgin in the distance, spotting it even through the heavy rain, but did not inform Captain Malott. Despite being in the path of the Lady Elgin, the Augusta stayed on course for the next 20 minutes. Finally, at around 2:20 a.m., Captain Malott ordered the Augusta to turn hard to starboard to bring the ship around into the wind. Nobody on the Lady Elgin could see the Augusta through the gale, because the schooner was only carrying one small lamp on its bow. By the time the crew of the Lady Elgin saw the schooner, it was too late. The Augusta was either not able to turn or made no attempt to avoid a collision. At 2:30 a.m., without warning, the Augusta appeared out of the blinding squall at top speed and rammed the Lady Elgin just aft of amidships on her port side. The Augusta crashed into the paddle wheel, ripping it completely off. The bow of the Augusta smashed into staterooms and crushed the decks inward. Worse still, a large gaping hole was revealed in the Lady Elgin's hull as the Augusta pulled away. Panic and confusion gripped the passengers and crew as the Lady Elgin was sinking. Captain Wilson immediately ordered all the passengers to the starboard side, lifeboats to be launched, and wooden life preservers to be distributed. He hoped to get the ship to list back to starboard, allowing him more time to reach shallower waters. Some passengers, however, were too in shock to even move. A crew member later commented, "I saw the ladies, pale, motionless, and silent. There was no cry, no shriek on board. No sound of any kind but that of the escaping steam and surging waters." 10 to 20-foot waves were battering the ship. To lighten the load of the sinking ship, Wilson ordered the cargo to be thrown overboard, including the cattle. He distributed wooden float preservers and urged passengers to try and hold on until they could reach shallower water. As the ship continued to list, passengers jumped into the water, fearing they would go down with the ship. Meanwhile, sailors below were making a desperate but futile effort to save the ship by stuffing mattresses into the gap in the hull. Firemen used their axes to chop away at the hurricane deck, hoping it could be used as a raft when the ship went down. Captain Wilson knew he was about to leave his ship and told everyone to try and remain still in the water to conserve their energy. Terrified passengers jumped into the water, frantically trying to get clear of the ship. Within just 20 minutes, the Lady Elgin had broken apart and sunk. As the ship went down, the hurricane deck did separate and served as a makeshift raft for about 100 people, including Captain Wilson. The surrounding water was dotted with people and debris from the ship. It is estimated 100 people drowned or were otherwise killed immediately following the collision. The Augusta was also badly damaged. Captain Malott backed the ship away from the Lady Elgin after the collision and found his ship's entire bow section was crushed, his foresails wrecked, and the ship was taking on water. There are conflicting reports of what happened next. Captain Malott later reported that he shouted to the Lady Elgin, asking Captain Wilson if he should stay, and Wilson told him to continue on. Others reported there was no response from Wilson. Nevertheless, the Augusta limped back to Chicago where Captain Malott reported the collision. He later testified he had no idea the Lady Elgin was seriously damaged or had sunk. Captain Wilson and about 40 others were holding on to a piece of the ship for hours in the water, but one by one they were dropping as exhaustion and hypothermia set in. By the time they could see the shore, only 8 were still alive. As the raft drifted toward shore, it struck a reef, throwing its passengers off. Captain Wilson died while attempting to rescue a woman who had been thrown clear of the raft. Others in the water clung to anything they could find: parts of the ship, personal items, even dead cattle. Those who were able to make it to shore were often overcome by the heavy surf and thrown against the jagged rocks, or dragged under by the strong undertow. Citizens on shore watched helplessly as survivors clutching makeshift rafts passed through the breakers, only to hit the violent waves and disappear under the surface. For anyone in the water, there wasn't much hope. Those that could struggled for hours to stay above water, but they were still in the middle of a vicious gale. Waves crashed down on them, and winds and strong currents proved insurmountable. Eventually, many of them slipped under the water and drowned. Second mate M.W. Beeman was one of those who held on for hours and ultimately made it to shore. He described his struggle to survive. When daylight came, we found we had drifted a long way in toward the shore. We landed near Winnetka. Striking the surf, we were upset. An effort and a stranger drowned. I was washed out from shore 2 or 3 times by the retiring waves, but at last managed to climb the bank. The collision came so quickly and without warning that only 2 lifeboats were able to be released prior to her sinking. 18 people in the lifeboats reached shore at Winnetka. A call for assistance went out from the Jared Gage house where the lifeboats made the shore. Residents from Winnetka rode on horses to nearby Northwestern University and Garrett Biblical Institute to find people to assist with the rescue, and the Winnetka Telegraph Service sent messages to the newspapers. The people of Winnetka and surrounding communities launched a superhuman effort to rescue as many people as possible. Men were lowered from a bluff using a rope in order to pull survivors to safety. One seminary student, Edward Spencer, rescued 17 people. He tied a rope around his waist and grabbed people out of the violent surf. When the rope was too short to reach a victim, he untied himself from the rope. He put himself in mortal danger several times, narrowly surviving. Exhausted and somewhat delirious, he asked his brother afterwards, "Did I do my best?" As a result of his efforts, Spencer was left with lingering physical ailments which plagued him for the rest of his life. He is honored with a plaque at Northwestern University, which tells of his heroism. Another student named Jacob Conrad rescued 28 people. Over the next several hours, 14 more survivors made it to shore on a makeshift raft, and another 60 on various floating debris. A drummer in the brass band even used a drum as a life raft to save himself. Some survivors were in the water for as long as 12 hours. Chicago and Milwaukee both offered free train transportation to people going to the wreck site. Some were on their way to help, and others were going to look for their loved ones.
My aunt was misidentified as Mary Mahoney, and then her brother, my aunt's brother, came up from Chicago and identified her. And so she was inquest number 20. But at first they thought it was somebody named Mary Mahoney, who was also on the ship. And then my uncle, his body wasn't found till October because the currents switched directions in September. And so he, along with Garrett Berry, are found way down in the Indiana-Illinois border, 100 miles away. When my uncle's body was found so much later, he was just buried by the people locally. And then they sent a message up to Milwaukee. And they said, well, who is he? So they exhume him. They look at him. They say, well, we think it's this guy named Albert Williams. And they rebury him. And the people up in Milwaukee goes, no, Albert Williams wasn't that big. So they ask him to exhume him a second time. And this time they identify it as my uncle. And my aunt's brother was one of the two people who went down to there to identify him also.
Not all of those who arrived on the scene were there to help. Newspapers described devils and beasts who ransacked the dead, looting the bodies of jewelry and other valuables. Just north of Winnetka in Highwood was Hank Maurer. He and others found a woman in black on the shore. She was wearing a gold watch, diamond rings, and a necklace with a gold pendant. They brought her to the old lighthouse so she could be identified, and town officials were notified. By the next morning, all of her jewelry was gone. Mowers claimed he saw the wife of one of the town officials wearing the same gold pendant necklace about 6 weeks later. In total, only 98 survived the wreck. At least 300 people lost their lives, although the lack of an official manifest makes it difficult to determine how many were on board. The first body to wash ashore was that of a 3-month-old infant girl. 21-year-old Eliza Curtin didn't wish to go on the excursion. Her mother, unfortunately, encouraged her to go. Eliza boarded the ship and did not survive. Out of all the survivors, only 8 were women. Captain Jack Wilson's body was found a week after the accident. His remains were taken to Coldwater, Michigan, where he is buried. After hearing Captain Wilson's family farm was in financial trouble, the Chicago Board of Trade raised enough funds to cover the debt for his family. Bodies continued to wash up on shore all around Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, and Indiana. Garrett Berry's body, along with a number of other victims, were found 2 months later near Michigan City, Indiana. Berry's remains were returned to Milwaukee. He was given one of the largest funeral processions in Milwaukee's history and was buried at Calvary Cemetery along with his son Willie. In 1899, Mowers was asked if any bodies were buried in the pasture in Highwood. He replied, "Yes, with my own hands, for I am a carpenter by trade. I made 4 coffins for 4 of the unidentified dead which the waves tossed ashore after the wreck of the steamer 39 years ago. I helped bury all 4. By that time in 1899, the cow pasture turned cemetery was overgrown and uncared for. Ultimately, the location of the graveyard was lost completely. It wasn't until over 150 years later that the location of the cemetery was rediscovered by the Highwood Historical Society. In Whiting, Robertsdale, a local man named Christopher Schrage found 5 bodies washed up on the shore. A town inquest was quickly arranged, and it was determined the unknown victims were all from the Lady Elgin. All 5 were placed in temporary graves. In time, some were recovered by family, and the rest were buried on the farm of local landowner Frederick Eggers. Many of the unidentified victims were laid to rest at Rose Hill Cemetery in Chicago. An article in the Chicago Tribune reported, 27 bodies, after long and hopelessly awaiting recognition and recovery by friends, were here tenderly buried side by side, in a tract set apart by the directors of Rose Hill. Along with Garrett Berry and his son, many other victims of the Lady Elgin were also laid to rest at Calvary Cemetery in Milwaukee. Their tombstones were inscribed with the words, "Lost on the Lady Elgin." Sadly, many of the dead were never found. Following the wreck, captain of the Augusta, Darius Malott, was charged and tried with navigational negligence, but he was found not guilty. The coroner's jury found his second mate and the rest of the crew were incompetent. More importantly, the laws at the time gave the right of way to a sailing vessel over a steamship and did not require sailing vessels to carry any running lights. The owner of the Lady Elgin, Gordon Saltonstall Hubbard, received $12,000 in insurance money. In March of 1861, Henry Clay Work wrote a song called Lost on the Lady Elgin, to much acclaim. A monument to the Lady Elgin and its victims was at long last in 1996 erected by the Wisconsin Historical Society on North Water Street in Milwaukee. Paul Timm, author of the book Lost Lady, The Lady Elgin Tragedy, is looking to find and remember the victims of the Lady Elgin, including his own relations who were on board the Lady Elgin: Patrick Fahey, his wife Mary, and their 10-year-old daughter, Mary Ann.
My great-great-great-grandpa and his brother Patrick, so my grandpa Michael and his brother Patrick, came to America from Ireland in the 1840s. They helped establish a town half hour outside of Milwaukee called Richfield, but my uncle decided he didn't want to be a farmer, so he went back into Milwaukee with his wife and daughter and 2 sons, and he became the constable of the 3rd Ward. And so my uncle and aunt and their daughter, the 10-year-old Mary Ann, were the 3 that actually went on the ship. They left behind the 2 little boys. And so I had found out from my cousin that we did have 3 family members on the ship. So they did make it all the way down there. And then on the way back, of course, was the collision with the Augusta. And from there, I did research and I found out, of course, that all 3 of them had died. So we had no survivors from our family. And then the 2 little boys were then adopted by my grandfather and went to live back out in Richfield with them. First, I wanted to find out what happened to my family. And then as I started writing the book, it changed. I started visiting the graveyards. I said, I need to do this for everybody that was on that ship. So the one that has mostly Irish in it would be called Calvary Cemetery. It's basically an Irish Catholic cemetery. Some of the Germans that were killed, because there were 2 German militias on the ship as well, they're buried at a second cemetery in Milwaukee called Forest Home. And so those were 2 of the cemeteries I would visit. And so my book in the back actually has all the pictures of gravestones, all their locations of anyone that I found, and even the survivors, if I could find theirs. I took pictures of their gravestones and I marked when they passed away later on. And many of them, of course, were buried right by their friends. It was very interesting to see the survivors, how close they were buried sometimes to the victims. Besides Calvary and Forest Home, I went to a number of historical societies. I actually went out to Richfield itself. I found my grandfather and grandmother's grave. I found the original homestead. The house is still there. It's not in the family. So I asked the people who live on the farm, is there maybe a family cemetery on the farm? And the 2 boys are like, no, we have been all over this farm and there's no such thing. So then a couple miles away is where my grandfather and grandmother are buried, and a couple other of the family. But down from there, there's a section of the cemetery where the absolute oldest graves are, and there's no headstones. And so when I went to check the records, of course, the records for that church were burned in a fire. So there are a few graves that are unidentified and the rest have headstones. So it's possible my aunt and uncle are buried there, but there's no way to know for sure. And I went into Milwaukee, and since my uncle and aunt were living in Milwaukee, I thought, well, they'd probably be buried with the rest of the Irish at Calvary. There's no record of them. I looked up my aunt's maiden name of Duffy, was not able to find anything there either. There are some Duffys buried in Calvary because that's an Irish cemetery. But when I went to the records, none of them matched up the names or dates of 1860 when this happened. So I did try a few other cemeteries that I thought might have it, but really had no luck.
A September 1860 edition of Scientific American asserted the lack of a $15 lantern caused the demise of the Lady Elgin.
Because of this particular wreck, after that, in 1864, they passed the law that all ships must have running lights because the schooner didn't have any. They didn't have to have them. And so now that's why all ships have lights on both sides, the red and the green. So it literally came out of this wreck that law was passed.
Later that same year, Captain Darius Malott was commanding the Mojave in Lake Michigan when the ship went down, killing Malott and his entire crew. The Lady Elgin is the worst maritime disaster in the history of the Great Lakes. While the SS Eastland wreck of 1915 killed 844 people, it occurred in the Chicago River and not technically in the Great Lakes. You can hear the tragic story of the Eastland in episode 10 of this podcast. The wreck of the Lady Elgin sat on the bottom of Lake Michigan until it was discovered in 1989 by Harry Zeik. Here again is Laura Zeeland to tell us about how a photo from the archives is connected to the finding of the Lady Elgin and its artifacts.
So Winnetka also has a historical society with archived photos, and one of these photos is of a guy named Pete Conrad. The photo is black and white, and Pete is wearing trousers with suspenders and a black turtleneck and cap. And in this photo, Pete is holding a piece of wood that's about 5 feet tall, and at his feet on the ground are the remains of a door. So it turns out that everything in the photo with Pete is part of the Lady Elgin. And Pete is connected to that sinking because his dad, Jacob Conrad, tied a rope around his waist and dove into Lake Michigan to help pull survivors out of the water in the early hours of September 8th. So, okay, fine. Pete's photographed with some wreckage, great. At first blush, this photo might not seem like much. But the photo is significant because that door is one of the few artifacts from the Lady Elgin that's not mired in controversy. In fact, the public would have access to a lot more of the ship, but like the sinking, the situation has been an absolute wreck. The whole controversy over the ship's artifacts started in 1989 when a private citizen named Henry Zeik actually found the ship in Lake Michigan. He'd searched for it for 20 years and put thousands and thousands of his own dollars into locating it. And once the wreck is discovered, Henry Zeik asserted what's known as the law of fines. So with historic shipwrecks, the law of fines means that the person who finds the wreck is now the new owner. The law of fines usually goes into effect when there's not a ton of treasure or valuables on the ship. Like if the Lady Elgin was packed with gold, a different law called the law of salvage would have been used. But the Lady Elgin really wasn't carrying a ton of valuables. And so by 1989, the wreck was 129 years old, and so Henry Zeik claimed the law of fines. And what this gives him, by the way, is access to what's at the bottom of the lake. So fine, it might not be gold and treasure chests, but it's, plates and chandeliers and shoes and boat parts and everything you can think of that went down with the ship. But archaeologists and scientists don't love it when the law of fines goes into effect. And that's because profit-motivated folks doing this work are really likely to ruin the historical integrity of the vessel. So if you value a wreck for historical reasons, you don't necessarily want someone just going in there and grabbing things and possibly destroying what's left. The Illinois Historic Preservation Agency and the Illinois Department of Transportation felt exactly this way. They really didn't love the idea of Henry Zeik messing with the wreck, so they sued him. And they claimed that the vessel and its contents belonged to the people of Illinois and should be preserved and displayed in a museum setting for the public benefit, something like that. But Zeik finds a way around this. Essentially, he goes to the company that had insured the ship's cargo and its hull. Now, of course, it's a different company now, one called Cigna, but the insurance paper trail is all there. So Zeik buys the ownership rights from Cigna, and he claims that because the carrier had instructed its agents not to abandon the vessel, it wasn't abandoned shipwreck legislation. So the court rules in his favor, and he's off to the bottom of Lake Michigan to collect relics. But the fight's not over, not by a long shot. This kicks off years of court battles that don't start to get resolved until 1993. That's when everybody settles out of court. Henry Zeik gives up his insurance title claim, and in return, he gets official recognition for his contribution to the cultural heritage of the people of Illinois. He's designated finder of the wreck, and he's told he'll get 20 grand for making the discovery and recovering artifacts for historic preservation. He agreed to return any of the artifacts he recovered. So that all sounds great, but the problem is that Zike was never paid. No one ever gave him his 20K. And so he's like, cool, you can't get your artifacts back until I get my money. And this kicks off another round of lawsuits and litigation with the state of Illinois demanding the artifacts back and Zike refusing, and it's just a mess. And so what Zike does is he creates an exhibition of the Lady Elgin artifacts. And, along the way, he's documented everything he can about her location on the lake bottom and what he's discovered. And he starts offering this exhibit to museums across the country in the spirit of allowing the public to engage with all of this rich history. So that sounds great. That sounds like the problem is solved, but it's not. Because this is really sad. Nobody wants the exhibit. The Lady Elgin, she's just no Titanic. So even though there was a door and I bet 2 people could fit on it, but still, nobody wants that exhibit. And the Boston Globe ran a story about Zike's inability to find a home for the artifacts of the Lady Elgin, and it quoted Brendan Bailrod, a Great Lakes maritime historian. And he said, quote, "Artifacts from most shipwrecks aren't attractive to museums anymore. The Titanic's sexy because of the 1997 movie. Other shipwrecks are not," end quote. So this leaves Zike with his artifacts, probably tucked under blankets in a storage unit somewhere, with nowhere to put them. But there is a silver lining to this, sort of. The public does have access to one artifact. It's that door, the door that Pete Conrad is posing with in the photo that I mentioned earlier. That door is actually on display at the Winnetka Historical Society. So if you're really inclined to see an artifact from the Lady Elgin, it's available. You can see the door that floated ashore in the early hours of September 8th, 1860.
The wreck lies in 4 main debris fields in about 50 feet of water. The wreck site was placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1999. Here is the song Lost on the Lady Elgin, performed by Lee Murdoch. The song can be found on his CD entitled Safe in the Harbor, and also in the book Lake Rhymes. You can hear more from Lee Murdoch at www.leemurdoch.com.
Up from the poor man's cottage, forth from the mansion door, sweeping across the valley and echoing along the shore, caught by the morning breezes, borne on the evening gale, comes the voice of morning, a sad and solemn wail. Lost on the Lady Elgin, sleeping to wake no more, numbered with those 300 who failed to reach the shore. Staunch was the noble steamer, precious the freight she bore. Gaily she loosed her cables a few short hours before. Grandly she swept our harbor, joyfully rang her bell. Little thought we ere morning 'twould toll so sad a knell. Lost on the Lady Elgin, sleeping to wake no more, numbered with those 300 who failed to reach the shore. A thunderstorm at midnight, big seas began to roll. 100 miles of water was the noble steamer's goal. But a fatal slash on her port side from a schooner bearing pine, an eerie silence shrouded all the dying engines' wind. Lost on the Lady Elgin, sleeping to wake no more, numbered with those 300 who failed to reach the shore. Oh, here's to Captain Wilson, may his soul forever rest, when his noble steamer plunged beneath the surging crest. leading songs and prayers for every woman, man, and child. He bravely faced the elements on that long night so wild. Lost on the Lady Elgin, sleeping to wake no more, numbered with those 300 who failed to reach the shore. And here's to Edward Spencer, who lived along the shore. That night the waves came breaking in with cries above the roar. 16 times he plunged into the boiling surf to rest, another soul to safety asking, did I do my best? Oh, 'tis the sound of children crying for parents gone. Children slept that evening, but orphans woke at dawn. Sisters for brothers weeping, husbands for missing wives. Such were the ties dissevered by those 300 lives. Lost on the Lady Elgin, sleeping to wake no more, numbered with those 300 who failed to reach the shore. Lost on the Lady Elgin, sleeping to wake no more, numbered with those 300 who failed to reach the shore.
Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is written, edited, and produced by me, Rich Napolitano. You can follow the show on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at ShipwrecksPod, and on Mastodon at shipwreckspod@c.in. You can also visit the podcast on the web at shipwrecksandseadogs.com. Thank you so much to Laura Zeeland, the host and creator of Archive Unknown podcast, and author Paul Tim for joining me to tell his story about his book and his family members that were on the Lady Elgin. And last but not least, thank you to Lee Murdoch for allowing me to use his performance of Lost on the Lady Elgin. Original theme music is by Sean Siegfried, and you can follow him on YouTube at Sean Secret or on the web at sean.siegfried.se. Please join me again in 2 weeks, and until then, don't forget to wear your life jackets.